It should be understood to be a real war, and it's not a new war, it's an old war. Furthermore, it's a perfectly conscious war everywhere, but specifically in the United States, where it's a very free country, but it happens to have a highly class-conscious business class, and always has. And it's very free and open, so you have a lot of information about it. They talk, you have their records, and they have long seen themselves as fighting a bitter class war, except they don't want anybody else to know about it. Occasionally someone else gets the news. Rather famous case, which I'm sure you know, was Doug Fraser about 20 years ago, 1978 I think, when he pulled out of the Labor Management Council and condemned business leaders for, words were roughly like this, for having decided to fight a one-sided class war against working people, the poor, the unemployed, minorities, even members of the middle class, and for having torn up the fragile social compact that had been achieved during periods of growth and prosperity. In fact, had been achieved, although he didn't say this, primarily through rather militant struggle, very militant struggle under harsh conditions back in the 1930s. Now, the only thing wrong with his statement is that it was way too late. In fact, that war that he's talking about was initiated as soon as the fragile social compact was established back in the 1930s, and very openly. There's no, you don't have to go to secret records to find out about it, nor do you have to have been at the wrong end of the clubs when the strikes were broken up in the late 30s to know about it. It was completely public. The reason it's not well known is because neither the educational system nor scholarship like Harvard and so on pay any attention to it. It's not a topic that's studied. So there's no doubt that one of the major issues of 20th century history, surely in the United States, is corporate propaganda. That's a huge industry. In fact, it extends over obviously the commercial media, but the whole range of systems that reach the public, the entertainment industry, television, a good bit of what appears in the schools, a lot of what appears straight out in the newspapers and so on. Huge amount of that comes straight out of the public relations industry, which was established in this country early in the century and sort of developed mainly in the 20s and on, and has become an enormous industry. It's now spreading over the rest of the world, but it's primarily here. And its goal from the beginning, perfectly openly and consciously, was to control the public mind, as they put it. And the reason was that the public mind was seen as the greatest threat to corporations. That's from early in the century. Business power was strong, but it's a very free country by comparative standards, and it's hard to call on state violence, not impossible, but hard to call upon state violence to crush people's efforts to achieve freedom and rights and justice. So therefore it was recognized early on that it's going to be necessary to control people's minds. I should say that's not a new insight either. You know, you can read it in David Hume and the Enlightenment, where it was already recognized. In fact, you go back to the earliest stirrings of democratic revolutions in England in the 17th century, and there already was concern that we're not going to be able to control people by force, and we therefore have to control them by other means, controlling what they think, what they feel, their attitudes toward one another. I mean, all sorts of mechanisms of control are going to have to be devised, which will replace the efficient use of force and violence that was available to a much greater extent earlier on, and as has been fortunately declining, you know, not uniformly, but often declining through the years, particularly here, leading to the need for other methods of control. You don't have to move very far from the Cambridge elite to learn about it. The leading figure of the public relations industry is a highly regarded Cambridge liberal, you know, Roosevelt Kennedy liberal, died recently, Edward Bernays. who wrote the standard manual of the public relations industry back in the 1920s, which is very much worth reading. Remember, I'm not talking about the right wing here. This is way at the left liberal end of American politics. His book, it's called On Propaganda, or maybe just Propaganda. I should mention that terminology changed during the Second World War. Prior to the Second World War, the term propaganda was used quite openly and freely for controlling the public mind. It got bad connotations during the Second World War because of Hitler and that sort of thing. So the term was dropped, and now there's other terms used. But if you read the literature in the social sciences and the public relations industry and so on, back in the, say, 20s and the 30s, they describe what they're doing as propaganda. This manual is for the rising public relations industry, and he opens by pointing out that the conscious manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is the essential feature of a democratic society. It's the essence of democracy, as he later pointed out. And he said, we have the means to carry this out now. He said, we have the means to regiment people's minds as efficiently as armies regiment their bodies. And we must do this. First of all, it's the essential feature of democracy, but also, sort of footnote, it's the way to maintain power structures and authority structures and wealth and so on, roughly the way it is. It's worth remembering something else that they usually don't teach you very much about in school, and that is, if you go back to the origins of American society, it was founded on the principle that was stated very explicitly by the leading framer, James Madison, at the Constitutional Conventions, that as he put it, the primary responsibility of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And Madison recognized, he's a smart guy, that this was going to be a serious problem if a democratic system were established. It was going to, if people had the right to vote, he used England as his model. England was the model for democracy in those days, right? It's like, we're talking about 1780s. And he pointed out in the debates on the Constitutional Convention, something which everybody ought to read in third grade in a free society. I mean, this is the origins of our society, He pointed out that in England, if they had the right to vote, which fortunately they didn't, he said pretty soon you would find people calling for redistribution of property and for a tax on property rights, for what nowadays we'd call agrarian reform. It was mostly an agricultural society. He didn't use the term agrarian reform, but the same thing. He said people will start calling for agrarian reform. Obviously that's intolerable, and we have to protect our own society against that kind of injustice by ensuring that the rights of property prevail. He recognized that, he said it's a problem now. He was already concerned in the 1780s by what he called symptoms of a leveling spirit. That is, people are trying to, feel that property ought to be more equitably distributed. That's a danger. But he said that the danger is going to become much more severe over time as more and more people are marginalized and dispossessed and secretly yearn for a more equal distribution of life's blessings. Now, if those people get the vote, we're going to be in trouble, because it's going to be hard to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority, which is what government's all about. And he therefore designed a constitutional system which was intended to prevent that danger. The system, the way he set it up, he and the other framers, because it was virtually unanimous, and there was virtually no disagreement about this. The one person who might have disagreed, Jefferson, was not part of any of this stuff. The constitutional system as he designed it was supposed to put power in the hands of the wealthy, who are the more capable set of men. I'm quoting. Power must reside in the hands of the wealthy, the more capable set of men, with the general population fragmented, factionalized, dispersed, in conflict, and so on and so forth. Well, this is like, we're now 1780s. Okay, it's been a pretty stable system. And as it's been harder, the franchise has increased. So over time, more and more people did get the right to vote. And that just raised the danger. Furthermore, the power of the state to coerce by violence, and that includes the power of private power, like the power of, say, Carnegie to hire Pinkertons and so on. As that has declined, the need to resort to these other measures of factionalization, instilling hatred, marginalizing people, straight propaganda, and so on, that's increased, and very consciously. So by the time you get to the 1920s, where I started from, it's recognized that huge resources must go into the conscious manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses, and we have to regiment them, their minds, as well as an army regiments their bodies, and we have the methods for it, and those methods are advertising, entertainment, straight propaganda in the media, schools, so on and so forth. The 20s was an important period in this regard. It looks as if labor is under attack now, but remember, in the 20s it had been smashed. The major American historian of labor historian, David Montgomery, has a book which you probably know, or should if you don't, called The Fall of the House of Labor. Very, sort of standards, important book on the history of the labor movement. It ends in the 1920s, because that's when the House of Labor had fallen. After, with a lot of violence in that case, state violence, Wilson's Red Scare, the leading labor leader was in jail, Eugene Debs, where the New York Times had said years ago he ought to be sent, and so on. It was, there'd been a big strike wave at the end of the First World War, smashed, labor movement destroyed, the whole thing wiped out. As Montgomery points out at the end of his book, labor had been virtually destroyed. Working people had to privatize their lives and aspirations. They sort of work out survival strategies for themselves, not with others, because the modes of cooperation and common struggle had been eliminated. And they did it, he ends up by saying, in a most undemocratic America, which is true. It was a highly undemocratic country, using a combination of modes of violence and coercion and repression and increasingly propaganda to prevent the dangers that Madison was worrying about, almost 200 years earlier, that more and more people would secretly sigh for a better access to life's blessings and might even do something about it if they had a functioning democracy, which therefore couldn't be permitted. I should just comment, in fairness to James Madison, that these remarks are not quite correct. The reason was that Madison was pre-capitalist. He's like just about everybody, Adam Smith, all the great figures from the Enlightenment. They're mostly pre-capitalist and very anti-capitalist in conception. You can't say they're anti-capitalist because there was no modern industrial capitalism around for them to have an opinion about. And this is a matter of interpretation. It's a matter of how you read texts, so you can read them a lot of different ways. But the way I read them, they were very anti-capitalist. That includes Adam Smith. And I think you can demonstrate that. But certainly Madison was. He believed that when he put power in the hands of the wealthy class of men, the more capable set of men, the wealthy of the country, that they were going to be, as he put it, enlightened statesmen and benevolent philosophers who would devote themselves to the welfare of all. Okay, that's a very pre-capitalist conception, that once you give power to the hands of the rich, they're just going to be benevolent philosophers and they're going to devote themselves, every minute of their day to the welfare of everyone else. I mean, it's like what corporate executives tell you now. They're sort of understand you have to say that, but by now, nobody, I suppose, nobody believes it except the people who read these, watch these movies, which show you how it works. In those days, Madison really believed it, and he very quickly discovered that it wasn't true. Within a few years, by I think 1792, he was already very upset about the fate of this democratic experiment, which he thought was failing. He condemned what he called the daring depravity of the times, as the business leaders who have now been given power use that power, he said, to become the tools and tyrants of government. They overwhelm government with their powers and combinations, and they're bribed by its largesses. And they're just serving self-interest, not the interest of the general public. And he thought that was deplorable and so on, but that's because he perceived the way the system that he had designed was actually functioning. That description, rhetoric is kind of nice. Some people don't use fancy rhetoric like that today, but it's a perfect description of today. What's called the industrial capitalist system today is in fact one in which private power is the tool and tyrant of government, overwhelms it by its combinations, it's bribed by its largesses. That's a pretty good description of 1997. With all the changes that have taken place since 1792, there's a good deal of stability to all this, including the commitment to the principle that the primary goal of government is to protect the minority, the opulent, from the majority. You read yesterday's budget proposal carefully and you'll get a good example of how that commitment plays itself out. And the increasingly significant idea, overwhelmingly significant idea, particularly among liberals, like, say, Bernays, that it is necessary to control people's minds because they're too much of a danger. We, as one of the leading, take a look at, say, the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, big encyclopedia in 1933, so this is still pre-Second World War. There actually is an entry on propaganda. Remember, propaganda was a usable term then. And the entry on propaganda is written by a very distinguished political scientist, liberal political scientist, Harold Lasswell, one of the founders of modern political science, in fact, of communications and so on. And it's worth reading. It's a page or two, Xerox it out and read it. He says, these are paraphrases, but they're pretty close to quotes. He says that we must not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about people being the best judges of their own interests. They are not. We're the best judges of their interests, we smart guys. We must therefore ensure that those idiots out there don't get into trouble, by actually using their theoretical right to vote to interfere where they don't belong, like in the public arena. So we got to keep them out of the public arena somehow and make sure that it's just us smart guys who are in there. And it's for their good, of course. It's kind of like you don't let, your 3-year-old, in my case, grandchild, run across the street, because she may want to run across the street, but it'd be improper to let her have that choice. And the same is true about the masses. They have to be controlled. They have to be controlled at the workplace. They have to be kept out of the political arena. They're not going to understand the need to protect the minority, the opulent, against the majority. They're going to have all these strange leveling impulses, and they're going to do all kinds of things which will, mess the world up in all sorts of horrible ways. So for their benefit, we have to regiment their minds the way an army regiments their bodies, ensure that they're under control, make it very clear that they don't participate in workplace management, and certainly not in the political arena. They're to be outside somewhere. And the dedication with which this task has been pursued is pretty awesome. Just to take right after the fall of the House of Labor in the 1920s, when American labor really was smashed, and people were privatized and tried to accommodate individually to a most undemocratic America, as Montgomery and others have pointed out. That was a time when there was great awe about the end of history and the utopia of the masters, and it's all over, us good guys have won, everybody else is at our feet, kind of like some of the stuff you read today. And it sort of looked like that, it's pretty much looked that way. Well, a few years later, as you know, the whole thing collapsed. And there was militant working class struggle and all sorts of other popular activism, and there had to be an accommodation. There had to be some kind of accommodation to these unwashed masses who were getting out of line, sit-down strikes and all sorts of things. And there was, indeed. There was this fragile social compact that Doug Fraser referred to was indeed established. It wasn't a gift, you know, it was won by struggle. Meaning the labor laws and the limited social system. In fact, American workers back in the 1930s began to get the rights that had been standard long before, even in much more brutal societies. You read the right-wing British press over the, say, early part of this century. They can't believe how bad American workers are treated. You know, the same was true of visitors from Australia and so on. By the 1930s, the U.S. was sort of brought into the more or less the mainstream of industrial society on these matters, to a limited extent, in fact, but to some extent. That caused hysteria among the masters. You read the business press by 1936 or 37. Again, these are things which in a really free society everybody would study in elementary school, because they're really important. These give the real framework of the society, in my view. They were talking about the hazard facing industrialists and the rising political power of the masses, and how we must do something to save ourselves or our way of life will be gone and we don't have a lot of time to do it. They started right away. By the late 30s, there was a big anti-labor campaign that had built up. With new techniques, you know. There was still use of force, but it was understood that that's not going to work the way it did. So there was a shift to more propaganda, community the main idea was called the Mohawk Valley formula, I guess. Is that what it was called? Something like that. Yeah, Mohawk Valley formula was designed by a lot of public relations hotshots around 36, 37, at the time of some of the steel strikes, to have new, what they called scientific methods of strike breaking. We don't just come in, you know, with clubs and shoot people and smash their heads and that sort of thing. We do it the scientific way, because the old way doesn't work anymore. And the scientific methods of strike breaking were in fact drawn from the public relations ideas of the kind that I talked about. The main idea was to mobilize the community against the strikers and the union activists, to present a picture which is by now so standard that you can hardly turn on the tube without seeing it, because it's just poured out in, you know, like streams ever since then. The basic idea is to present a picture of the world that looks kind of like this. There's us, you know, kind of like a big happy family in the community. You know, the honest workman going off every morning with his lunchbox, his loyal wife who's making the meals and taking care of the kids, the hard-working executive who's toiling day and night in the interests of you know, his workers and the community, the friendly banker who's running around looking for people to lend money to, and so on and so forth. That's us, you know, and we're all in harmony. Harmony was a big word. We're in harmony, we're all together. It's Americanism. You might take a look at that word Americanism. It's an unusual term. It's the kind of term that you only find in totalitarian societies, as far as I know. So like in the Soviet Union, anti-Sovietism was considered the gravest of all crimes, you know, and the Brazilian generals had some concept like that, anti-Brazilian. But try, say, publishing a book on anti-Italianism and see what happens in the streets of Rome or Milan. I mean, people won't even bother laughing. It's a ludicrous idea. The idea of Italianism or you know, Norwayism or something like that, these would just be objects of ridicule in societies that have some kind of residue of a democratic culture inside people's heads. I don't mean in the formal systems. But in totalitarian societies it is used, and as far as I know, the United States is the only free society that has such a concept. Maybe there's another one. You might try it in places, you know. But anyhow, Americanism is an anti-Americanism and un-Americanism and so on. These are concepts which go along with harmony and getting rid of those outsiders and all that kind of stuff. Another part is simply to induce hatred and fear among people. So it's a diverse society. You know, you go to Europe, most places are pretty uniform. This is a very diverse society. So it's easy for propagandists. It's pretty easy to get people to, you know, hate the guy next door because it looks a little different or one thing or another. And huge campaigns go on to instigate divisions among people. I don't have to tell you about this. It's all so familiar. go on. But these are very natural techniques of social control. If you can't control people by force, you have to control their minds, you have to control their attitudes, you have to, exactly like they say. Well,